What's going on, guys? ACP here with another Marvel Snap video for the month. I just got to Infinite in the last week of the season, and the climb was kind of interesting because the first 3 weeks of the season, I had a bit of trouble. I got kind of hard stuck in the 80s, and then what happened is, I did get to Infinite, and the way I got there was in the last week of the season, I saved up 6,000 collector's tokens, unlocked Thanos, and just went to town. It got to Infinite extremely quickly, extremely easy, and I want to talk about why that is, because I think Thanos is really a problem for Marvel Snap. Not really Thanos the card, but Thanos the deck as it exists right now, I think is very overpowered, and I'll explain why. So I will talk a bit about my card choices. I'll talk a bit about why I think this deck is overpowered, and then I will briefly discuss nerf. I'm not really going to show you any games. There's tons of videos on YouTube where you can see people playing games with Thanos if you want to see. This list is pretty standard. Really, there's only a couple of cards I think that are different from list to list. Not all of the lists play Okoye, and not all of them play Arrow. But, the other 10 cards I think are pretty standard. And I will talk about both the standard choices and the perhaps not so standard choices. Really, I think I don't know if I want to say the best card in this deck, but I think the problem card in this deck is Quinjet. And the reason why is that Quinjet is the only cost reduction card in Marvel Snap that doesn't have minimum 1. So, Sarah reduces your cards by 1, but it says minimum 1. Zabu, I think, also says minimum 1. I'm not sure what other cost reduction cards there are. In general, cost reduction is very powerful in Marvel Snap, and even more powerful when it doesn't have that minimum 1. So what that does, Quinjet, is it makes all of your stones from Thanos cost 0. Which makes a bunch of other cards in this deck better. And the Thanos stones, they're already pretty good. You look at a card like Soulstone, right? And it's oh, if, there's 4 cards in that lane, then the Soulstone is effectively 5 power for 1 energy. Because it's, debuffing by 4, and it itself has 1. And you're drawing a card. So, already this is insane value. Or you look at something you look at something like Time Stone, right? Just better Psylocke, right? It's a Psylocke that only costs 1, and you draw a card. Amazing value. So you take these cards that are just already such great value and say, oh, by the way, they all cost 0 now. That is just extremely good. And in particular, the thing that Quinjet does is since the stones cost 0, it makes Lockjaw a lot better. Lockjaw kind of go back a while in Marvel Snap, I think. I haven't been playing since the beta, but from what I understand, in the beta, people use them. And, before we saw, some of the Lockjaw Thor decks that played cards like Wasp, and you had Jane Foster to search the hammer, and the idea was, oh, you have this Wasp and this hammer. This is a 0-cost card you can play under Lockjaw and get pretty good value. We're basically doing that, except now we have 6 cards that cost 0, that have really good effects, right? Obviously, Wasp is just a terrible card, whereas our 0-cost stones are not terrible cards. So, assuming you have access to every card in the game, in my opinion, if you're playing Lockjaw, but not playing Thanos, you're just playing a worse version of this deck. I know some people will maybe take that the wrong way or say, oh, no, you can play different Lockjaw decks. I mean, you can, but, they're just worse than this deck because they're just doing less powerful things. And also interesting is that Quinjet also makes Sunspot better. Sunspot, obviously a very strong card in Marvel Snap in general, but all of that energy that you're saving on your stones, a lot of times you don't spend it. You'll have turns where, you play a bunch of stones on turn 3 or turn 4, but not really spending much energy. You put it all into Sunspot. You reduce the cost of your She-Hulk. So to me, Quinjet is kind of the glue that holds this deck together. Your hands that have Quinjet in them are significantly stronger than your hands that don't. To the point where I'd say, if you have a Quinjet on turn 1, you can just snap. You can just snap. Like, it's just that good. It's basically this deck's Zabu. If you remember last season's Zabu pre-nerf. I don't think it's nearly as strong as Zabu, but, like, it has similar vibes. The other point that I want to make about this deck is I know to some extent, like, when people call for nerfs, it's sort of like the boy who cried wolf in the sense that people are always calling for nerfs. In most cases, I think on cards that don't need to be nerfed. Like, I see a lot of people saying Shang-Chi needs to be nerfed, for example, which I think is nonsense. Because sort of the general argument is, people say, oh, X card needs to be nerfed, and then people counter with, oh, no, you can counter that, right? Shang-Chi doesn't need to be nerfed. We can counter it with armor. Or, whatever, oh, Wong doesn't need to be nerfed. We can counter it with Cosmo, right? So that's generally, like, how that argument goes is, typically ignorant people say X needs to be nerfed. More intelligent people respond with, no, it doesn't. There are counters. The issue, in my opinion, with this deck is that I don't think it has a lot of counters. Like, there are individual cards that are good against some pieces of this deck, but even if your goal was to build a deck and all it was trying to do was counter Thanos, I still don't think you would be able to. And the main reason is because of Leech. Like, Killmonger can be very good against this deck, but if you're playing Killmonger on, like, turn 3, turn 4, it's not as strong. Because it's like, oh, you kill, like, 2 stones. Who cares? So ideally, you would want to play Killmonger on turn 5 or turn 6 to get more value, get, like, a bigger surprise, win those 8 cubes. But if you're holding Killmonger until, like, turn 6, you're just going to get leeched. And this deck theoretically can play Leech as early as turn 3, which is, a bit problematic if you're hoping to counter this deck. And, Leech, some people will call for Leech to get nerfed. I think Leech is a pretty fair card. Like, 5 energy for only 3 power, that's a pretty big downside for what you're doing. The problem is that, like, this deck has so many more ways to abuse it than normal decks do. Like, in a normal control deck where you're playing Leech, I think it's fine. If you're playing an Electro ramp deck with Leech, I think that's totally fair. If you're going, like, turn 1 Quinjet, turn 3 Lockjaw, and 3 Stones, and then just flipping into Leech on turn 3, yeah, that's way too good. Or, even if you're just going, where is it? If you're just going Time Stone on turn 3 and Leech on turn 4, that's still pretty good. Even if you're just going Lockjaw on 3, Leech on top of the Lockjaw lane, turn 5, oh, I Leech your hand and swap it out for, like, a Devil Dino, or swap it out for a Chavez or something. That, even just that is very strong. So, yeah, from my experience, it was a very easy climb. Once I got up, like, into the 90s, it was mostly just other Thanos decks, right? Yeah, you did see, like, some other, like, kind of tier 2, tier 3 decks. Like, yeah, I saw some Patriot decks. Yeah, I saw some discard decks. But this deck just crushes those decks the vast majority of the time. We have a lot of cards that are just generally good against the meta, like Arrow and Shang-Chi. Although I don't really think you have to play either of them. We have a bunch of cards that are just raw stats. Devil Dino, She-Hulk. Even like Okoye, I think Okoye is like low-key pretty slept on, just in terms of the raw stats that it gives you. You could easily, if you're playing it on like turn 2, you could be buffing 6 or 7 cards. I mean, it can very easily end up being, 7 or 8 points for 2 energy, which is really strong. Sometimes you just play Lockjaw on 3 and play Okoye on 4, and that's fine too, because it's like, hey, I play Okoye, buff my deck, flip into something, boom, it's got that buff. And you're just drawing so many cards, you'll get to see a lot of buffed cards. So, yeah, I think Okoye is really strong. I think you kind of have to play it. I do see some lists playing like Magneto instead of Arrow. I think Arrow is just a far better card. I don't think Magneto is very good just because, like, you don't see a lot of 3 and 4 cost cards in this meta. Like, Magneto was very good in the Zabu meta because you just had a ton of things you could move around. But, like, against Thanos, what are you going to move around? Like, oh, you're going to move around my one Lockjaw? Like, you know, big deal. So, yeah, I don't think, like, Magneto is much better than the Hulk on average. But Arrow, of course, is one of the strongest cards in Marvel Snap. And, frankly, I think it needs to get nerfed again. I think they should make it, like, a 5/5. Even if they did, it would still see tons of play. So I think Arrow has a nerf coming to it. I hope the devs understand how ridiculous Quinjet is and they nerf it. Really, I think they just need to add the min 1 to its text. But even if they make it like a 1/1, really a 1/1 wouldn't be much of a nerf, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. So yeah, my view is this deck very easily got me to infinite, but I'm not one of these people who has this attitude of, oh, I spent 6,000 tokens on Thanos, you better not nerf my deck. I don't care. You know, I was happy when they nerfed Zabu and Surfer, which is what I made infinite with last season, and I would be happy if they nerfed this deck too. They got to keep it interesting, because if this deck doesn't get nerfed next season, it's just going to be like, hey, do you have the 6,000 tokens for Thanos? If you don't, like, good luck. That's my honest opinion. It really is. So, yeah, let me know what your guys' thoughts are, and thanks for watching the video. You know, I'm happy to have made Infinite for 3 seasons in a row now, but I do think this deck is very overpowered. I really do. I think we need to do something about this. Take care, guys.